Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Diploma in Photography. As per usual, before we go any further this evening, I just want to make sure that everybody can hear me loud and clear. So just type in yes into the chat box just to confirm that you can hear me loud and clear. Fantastic. Lots of yeses coming in there already. I can see Ian, I can see Ruth, Haley, Kevin, Debbie there, ready to go. Neil, Sophie D, Nadia, we have Fiona there as well. Richard, fantastic. Loads and loads of yeses. And great to see everybody back for our final week in Diploma in Photography. Hard to believe we are on the penultimate lesson already, and I hope everybody has been enjoying the course so far. We have covered a lot over the last 3 weeks, so we still have the two lessons this week, of course. We've certainly covered a lot, though. We've gone from mastering our apertures, our shutter speeds. We've brought them together and we've created our own exposures. We've got to the fully manual mode. We've mastered our composition. So we have done a huge amount in a short amount of time. And we're going to continue that on this week. We're going to have a look at white balance tonight, the color of light. And we'll also talk a little bit about focusing and how we can improve the focusing in our photography as well. So a little bit of housekeeping to get through as per usual. You are here with myself, William Eames, as always, and as always we have the wonderful support team here as well, helping me out, answering all of your questions. Anything that I don't get a chance to answer throughout these lessons, they will be able to answer them for you. So let's dig right on into this evening's lesson and this week's lessons. Indeed, we're going to have a look at now tonight. We're going to start by having a look at why we want to learn about white balance. So if you're not sure what white balance is, we're going to have a look at what exactly white balance is first of all, and this involves understanding color temperature. We'll also talk about the different types of lights that we photograph under. As photographers, we photograph under so many different types of light sources in our day-to-day photography. From just photographing indoors to outdoors, there's a big change in the quality of light and a big change in the temperature of light as well. This has a big impact on our photographs. So we'll have a look at how the camera handles this with auto white balance. We'll have a look at some white balance presets for when the camera gets it wrong. We'll also talk about how we can set it manually then, if we get a little bit more advanced with our photography and we're feeling more confident about it, we can actually set the white balance manually as well. And then we'll dig into our focus point selection and focusing modes a little bit later on in the lesson as well. And I'll show you a particular technique that a lot of photographers use, including myself, and to get a more accurate photographs in terms of the focusing, and I'm sure we've all struggled a little bit with focusing on our cameras. So I'll show you a little bit of a trick later on that should give you more consistent results. And of course we'll have our summary, and hopefully we'll have a bit of time for a Q&A and everything at the end of the lesson as well. So, first of all, can anybody tell me what is the problem with this photograph? Now, we've seen this photograph plenty of times throughout this course, and here we see it again. But can anybody tell me now, what's the issue here with this particular version of this photograph? It should be quite apparent. And Sophie, you're in there straight away. Yeah, absolutely. It is, Hugo saying it there as well. It's very blue or purple. So you can see there's something wrong with the color. Now, it might look slightly overexposed. It might look slightly purple, it might look more blue to you. It depends on the monitor that you're looking at, or if you're looking at it on a phone and so on as well. But the main issue here with this photograph is that the color is incorrect. Okay, it looks very cold to our eyes, and Nick has just said it there. It looks too cold. So white balance is all about getting accurate colors within our photographs, and it's very important to understand this, because white balance really affects the overall quality, the overall feeling to your photographs. If you're faced with a situation like this, a wedding, or a photograph for a in terms of studio work, doing the photographs of children and babies and so on, You know, these are situations that are very, very important to get right because you're photographing for a client. You know, you can imagine if you're photographing a wedding and you give back the photographs that look like this, where the dress has kind of got a yellow or an orange kind of tint to it, the bride's not going to be very happy. And similarly here, if you're giving back this photograph of the baby to the parents, the baby looks a bit sickly because there's a green cast to the skin, they're not going to be happy at all. So as photographers, you need to firstly be able to identify the problem, troubleshoot, and then correct it. Otherwise, you could miss the shot, and you end up, under pressure, not being able to fix and resolve these technical issues. And in this case, a bad understanding of white balance results in these types of photographs that are not very appealing to the client or to the viewer. And obviously, this will paint a bad picture of your skills, and it could end up, meaning that costing you referrals and costing you more work in the future. But it's even just also for your own personal photography as well, that you want to make sure that everybody in your photographs and everything in your photographs looks happy and healthy and correct. When you turn up the temperature very, very, very high, the flame, and Neil has just said it there as well, and so is Jyoti and Ian, it goes blue. Absolutely, you're totally spot on, guys. It turns blue. And that's because the color temperature of it, so it actually gives you a colder looking flame, but the temperature itself is actually incredibly high. And it's the opposite then. When you turn down the temperature, you actually get a very intense orange flame, a very, very intense orange flame, but that's actually a lower color temperature. Okay, so that's kind of how the Kelvin scale works. Now, as photographers, we tend to say what we see, okay, because we like to keep things nice and simple for ourselves. So the physics behind it is that the higher the temperature, the colder the light it produces. But as photographers, we tend to just say what we see. So if we see a warm photograph, a warm looking photograph that has lots of oranges and reds in it, we call that a warm photograph, when in actual fact the color temperature is quite cold, is quite low. Okay, so does that make sense? I know it's a little bit of a contradiction. So the physics behind it is that the higher the color temperature, the colder it looks. But as photographers, we like to keep it simple. We say what we see, and we would say a warm photograph is a photograph that has lots of reds and lots of oranges in it, and so on. Yeah, I know it's a little bit of a contradiction, but it's just to give you an idea of the physics behind it. But as I said, photographers just want to keep things nice and simple, and we just say what we see. And different light sources and different times of the day can create a color cast in our photographs. Okay, so color casts in our photographs is, as we've seen with those previous examples, is when we have a particular color on the photograph that's very apparent. Like for example, with the bride and the groom photograph, there was a color cast of orange or yellow to the photograph, and it can be seen as a positive or a negative thing. Probably more negative than positive in most cases, as we'll see later on, but you can take control of color temperature and use it creatively. Now, before we look at color temperatures, I want to talk about this term that comes up a lot in photography called daylight. Now, daylight is a term in photography, not just a time of day, that has no color cast. You may have heard the term daylight balanced lights before. Daylight balanced means a light that has no color cast. It's a light that is white. There's no color in that light that is falling on the scene. Daylight light is white light, and therefore when it falls on the subject, all the colours in the image will look correct because they are not contaminated by another colour in the light source. Now, don't worry if that's a bit confusing. We'll have a look at some examples and make it visual, and it should make a little bit more sense. Here we have an example of a photograph that is daylight balanced, basically photographed under white or neutral light. Okay, it does not contain any contaminating colours. Now, can anybody tell me how we can identify that this photograph has no colour cast? There's no contaminating colours in the shot. Just by looking at the photograph, how can I know that there's no colour cast to this image? Dorian, yeah, you're spot on. Hugo is correct as well. Debbie, yeah, you're correct there as well, Debbie. But Debbie, you're saying the skin tone looks normal. Well, there's another way we can identify it, an easier way, and that is by looking at the whites in the photograph. So we can see here we've got this lady on a white background. She's also wearing a kind of a light white, almost kind of grey, clothing here as well. But the white is white. Okay, if the whites are white, then all the colours will be free of contamination as well. Now, this is a very easy photograph to identify it as being correct because there's a lot of white in the photograph. It can get a little bit trickier when there's nothing as obvious as this to identify in the shot, but this will also come from training as well, from training your eyes. But for the moment, we can see that everything is nice and white in the background, which means that there's no color contamination in the photograph. If we had a little bit of yellow, or if there's a little bit of green or a little bit of blue in the background, that would mean that there's contamination in the photograph. So let's have a look at some other examples of this. So one of the most common lighting conditions that we would find ourselves in is fluorescent light. Now, if you're not familiar with fluorescent light, this is usually the overhead lighting tubes that you'd find in office spaces. I'm looking at some right now, or industrial buildings and so on. And it covers a fairly broad range in terms of color temperature. Okay, it goes from about 4,000 to 7,000 kelvins. But the most common is kind of the higher kelvins, about 7,000 kelvins. Now, if we have a look at this photograph here, this photograph has contamination. Okay, so it's shot underneath a fluorescent light, and we can have a look at the scientist's coat here and the microscope and the paper here as well, and we can see that there is a cast of color here. It's kind of an aqua, almost kind of bluey green kind of color to it, and this looks incorrect. And exactly, a few people just saying it there as well. It looks a little bit more greenish, bluish than it should be. A blue tint to it. Yeah, absolutely. So we can identify that there is an issue here with this photograph in terms of the white balance. Now, LED lights, I usually get asked this question a lot. LED lights will also fall within this kind of color cast, this kind of Kelvin scale as well, in and around 4,000 to about 7,000 kelvins, where you get this kind of aqua-y kind of cast to the photograph. It looks very cold, and it's not appealing here to this particular shot. Now, candlelight is a cold light source in terms of the color temperature, but we say it produces a warm photograph. Remember, as photographers, we say what we see. So we say this is a warm shot, and it's a low Kelvin value of about 1,500 to 2,000 kelvins, and it produces strong red-orange tones across the photograph. Now, this is quite atmospheric, and it's certainly for this photograph here, it's a positive effect that it has on the shot because it adds, to the candlelight and so on as well. But if we're talking about it technically, okay, the tones are not represented accurately, and we can see here, if we have a look at the color of the wall, okay, it's hard to identify what color that wall should actually be, because we can see here that it definitely has kind of an orangey red color to it. But if you were to photograph this in a daylight situation, that wall might appear actually grey or light white and so on. So it's actually hard to say what colour that wall should be because there is a cast to the photograph. However, as I said, this is an example of a positive effect of white balance on the photograph. It adds atmospheric to, or an atmosphere even, to the photograph. So another effect of this as well would also be when we're photographing in morning or evening light. Now, one question I always get asked by students is, how do I take better photographs of sunrises and sunsets and so on? And white balance, controlling white balance is going to be a way that you can do this, because you're going to be able to photograph at a white balance and add a little bit more orange to the shot, a little bit more red to the photograph. So morning sun will produce about 2,500 kelvins in terms of color temperature, and again produces strong orange tones in your photograph. So when you're out shooting in the early sun or the late evening, it's the The color of the light that it produces, are these strong, deep red and orange tones. And you're going to be able to use white balance here, to enhance your sunrises and your sunsets as well. So again, this is an example of where being able to control the white balance, you can use it creatively in your photography. Now, if we have a look at tungsten light. Now, tungsten light, if you're not familiar with it, and is again one of the most common situations we'll find ourselves photographing in. Tungsten lights are the types of lights that we would typically find, at home. Coming from bedside lamps or lamps like this and so on. Even from overhead lighting that you might have at home as well. And it usually falls in and around 3000 kelvins. And it produces very strong orange yellow colors, and you can see here this would be a negative effect to the photograph, a kind of a negative use of white balance. As we can see, the skin tone here does not look correct. It's a little bit too yellow. Now it's nice to have a little bit of warmth and so on, in the photograph, but here it's a bit too much. It doesn't look healthy. It looks like it's a bad tan and so on as well. This is certainly not how you'd want to be representing people, when you're photographing. So tungsten light is a very tricky one to deal with as photographers. And, many of us will be photographing our family at home and so on as well. And this is typically the type of situation that we'll be photographing them in. We want to be able to make sure that we can control the white balance to correct these types of issues. Now, an excellent example as well of colder temperatures and cold white balance is this simple snow scene. Now, this one is always an interesting one in terms of the response that it gets, because this might sound like the most basic question, but what color should snow be? It might sound like a no-brainer, okay, but what colour should snow be? Yes, absolutely. Chat box going crazy there. It should be white. Okay, so it should be white. Now, that might sound so simple and so obvious, but as we can see here in this photograph, it's not. It's blue. It has a very cold look to it. However, that blue does add something to the shot. It gets a sense of coldness coming through here in the photograph by having that little bit of blue in the photograph. However, technically, as photographers looking at this, we know that the snow should be white. Okay, the snow should be white. It shouldn't be grey. It shouldn't be blue. It shouldn't be yellow. Hopefully not yellow. It shouldn't be orange and so on. It should be white. But here we can use it, in terms of adding a little bit of atmosphere to the photograph. Okay, so it gets a sense of coldness through in the shot. But if we're talking about it in a purely technical viewpoint, the snow should be white. Okay, so does everybody understand that for the moment? These are just some basic, situations you might find yourselves in as photographers when it comes to tricky lighting situations. And you can see from the examples that we've used that you can use white balance in positive and negative ways. The majority of the time we want to try and correct white balance and get it right in camera. But you can use it for these kind of creative decisions as well. So how can we control it? Okay, so how do we take control of the white balance in our photographs? Well, first of all, the camera is going to use auto white balance. Okay, so auto white balance is the process where the camera will constantly calibrate itself or adjust itself to the different color temperatures for in these different lighting conditions to make sure that you're getting the correct white balance in your scenes. By default, your camera is probably using the auto white balance already, and most auto white balance systems will do a really good job. So as usual, check out your own camera and your camera's manual to find the auto white balance. It's usually just WB, and then you can set it to AWB, auto white balance, and so on. And generally it will be set to this by default. Now, how white balance works, auto white balance works, in terms of the technology, how it works, it's very difficult to get accurate information because most camera manufacturers will keep the specifics of their systems a trade secret because there's patents on their systems and so so on. But it's usually based on the idea that the camera will look for the brightest object or brightest tone in your image, and it assumes that this is white. And then it chooses a white balance setting, and it makes this adjustment based off this, and it should give you the correct white balance setting for that scene. Now, can anybody tell me what the problem might be here? Okay, so if the auto white balance system assumes the brightest object in the scene is white, what might be the issue here? Yeah, exactly. If the brightest object is not white, say the brightest object in your photograph is yellow, or the brightest object in your photograph is grey or something like that, then it's going to set the white balance incorrectly. Okay, the camera has no way of knowing that the brightest object in the photograph is white. It assumes that it's white, but it may not necessarily be white. Now, that's an extremely simplified version of what is really going on, because it's very complex in terms of the technology. And in general, camera manufacturers have done a great job of creating auto white balance systems that work incredibly effectively. And for most situations, auto white balance will generally do a great job. But the main thing to understand is, as lighting conditions change, that the auto white balance has to rebalance, and it can then sometimes give you inaccurate readings and so on. And this is just going to be another thing that you'll have to keep an eye on as your photography skills develop. It'll be another thing for you to keep an eye on and understand, what is happening, and to be able to know how to make the adjustments if something is going wrong. So, going back to the scientist, here are two photographs again. We saw this photograph a little bit earlier. The auto white balance has corrected this particular photograph now. So originally we photographed it, we had the fluorescent light creating the cast over the photograph, as we could see in the lab coat in particular. But now we have corrected it. The auto white balance has done a correction here, and we can see that the scientist here is looking much happier, much healthier. The colors are looking a lot more accurate as well. Can everybody see the difference quite clearly there? It should be quite apparent. Now, I don't think it's perfect. I still think there's a slight cast, and it might be on my own monitor here as well. I think there's a very, very slight magenta cast in the lab coat there, but certainly it's a lot better than the original photograph. So I think this is a good example of showing that auto white balance will get it very, very close, and sometimes we'll get it 100% accurate. But sometimes you may still need to do a little bit of refining and so on as well. And this is where our preset modes will come into play. When the white balance gets it wrong, we can use these preset modes as a fallback, okay? So remember, the main thing to be aware of is that when you've changed lighting conditions, and this is all going to be a part of developing your technical skills and awareness of lighting conditions, but when you change lighting conditions, you might see a big change in the colors in your photographs. Most of the time, you'll be thinking, oh, I've just changed lighting conditions, but I'm still going to stick with the auto white balance, and it should do a good job for me. And a good example is if you're out photographing on a very sunny day, okay, but you might spot something in a shaded area, maybe underneath a roof or a canopy and so on. This is a lighting change, and the white balance therefore is going to change. Now again, you might just say, I'll stick it in the auto white balance and it should be fine. But the reason I'm using shading as an example is because shade is often a lighting condition that the auto doesn't quite get right. So, as we have seen, the camera goes ahead, it calculates a white balance of what it thinks the color temperature is. And say it picks a Kelvin value of 7,000, it changes itself to that to compensate for the different color of the light. Okay, so a preset is simply just a preset temperature or Kelvin value that you can set the camera to if you know the lighting condition that you're photographing in. And again, these are just common lighting conditions, and that they can just be drawn upon if the camera gets it a little bit wrong. So let's have a look at an example of this. So we've got a photograph here taken under a slight shade here, slight shade with the camera set to the auto white balance. Now it might look pretty much okay, but can anybody tell me what's wrong with this photograph? I mean, initially looking at the photograph, it looks okay. Yeah, I can see a few people saying there now. Yeah, I mean, and for me as well, just looking at it, it looks a little bit cold. Okay, he doesn't look as healthy as he does in real life. It's there's a cold kind of feeling coming to the photograph. And yeah, Sophie, you're spot on. You can identify it in the teeth here. You're well done there, Sophie. There's a little bit of a blue cast to it again, so it's a little bit cold. Okay, so initially looking at the photograph, you might think it's okay, but the auto white balance hasn't got it totally accurate. Okay, so really what is happening is the auto white balance has just made the photograph slightly too cold by picking a Kelvin value that isn't quite right. Now in this case, because I can see it's not quite right and the auto white balance hasn't worked, I can now fall back on one of my presets. Okay, so as I mentioned, a preset is just a predetermined, a predefined Kelvin value that I can pick if I know the correct lighting condition. And in this particular case, I photographed this in a shady area, so I can choose the shade preset. Now, let's see what happens. So by using the shade white balance preset, you can see that the color temperature or the white balance of the image has changed dramatically. Now we'll compare them side by side now in a moment, and you should be able to see a little bit more clearly. But here we can see that there's a lot more life in him now. His skin is looking a little bit more warmer. The teeth are looking a little bit more correct now here as well. Even the background has changed colour as well. And he looks a lot closer to what he resembles in real life. So the shade preset has done a much better job than the auto in this situation. And let's just have a look at the two of them side by side. So now we can really see the difference. We can clearly see the difference now between the two of them. At least I hope we can see the difference between the two of them. Again, the one here on the left is a lot colder, a lot cooler. But the one here on the right, he actually looks like there's blood running through his veins now here as well. Looking a lot happier, a lot healthier. But as I mentioned here as well, you can even see the background color has changed. It's gone from this kind of blue color to a much more kind of green color, and overall the photograph just looks a lot more appealing. So you can see here, the difference by simply using a preset rather than using the auto white balance. And these are great to fall back on if you're finding that the auto white balance just isn't getting it quite right. Now, the daylight here as well, in terms of our presets, there is a daylight preset. And the daylight preset is considered a common daylight temperature, which is about 5,500 kelvins. 5,500 kelvins. And daylight is usually what the camera is trying to achieve in auto mode on the auto white balance anyway. But this preset is there as well for when the auto is not getting it quite right in a standard daylight scene. You will also have this option called kelvins as well, and kelvins will allow you to dial in your own color temperature, so you can actually just set the temperature yourself. You could dial in whatever number you like, ranging usually from about 2000 all the way up to 10,000 kelvins. You can actually just dial it in as well. But it is possible to set our white balance manually as well. Now this is a little bit more advanced, but as your photography develops and you begin to understand white balance more, you'll begin to notice and consider the slight differences between colour and tones in your photographs. You'll also begin to see the slight shifts you get from auto white balance, and you might want more consistent white balance in your photos. So when you get to this point, you might consider manual white balance. Manual white balance is a much more accurate way of telling the camera exactly what Kelvin setting is needed for the scene. Now, to use it, you need to have a grey card. Now, a grey card is exactly what it sounds. It is just a grey card that you can place in your scene, whatever scene you're photographing, and it's used for, you can actually use it for getting accurate exposures, but you could also use it for setting your white balance as well. Okay, so how it works is that you simply put the grey card in your scene under exactly the same lighting as the subject is in. you photograph the grey card. So you actually take a photograph of the grey card, and then through your camera's custom white balance menu, you'll be asked by the camera to select the image that you would like to use to set the custom white balance. So you then go ahead and you select the image of the grey card that you've just taken, and the camera goes ahead, assesses the picture, and it decides what Kelvin value is needed to correct the color temperature in the image of the grey card. Now, that might sound quite complicated, but it's actually very, very straightforward. So I'll just run through that process again. So you place your grey card in the scene. So in this particular situation, really what the photographer should be doing is actually placing the grey card beside the children, or getting one of the children to hold the grey card. The photographer takes a photograph of the grey card, goes into the white balance menu. There's an option called custom white balance. When you select custom white balance, you can select the photograph of the grey card, and then you set the white balance from that. The camera will go ahead and set the white balance from that. And I can see Ebony, you're saying, I've seen studio photographers do this. Yes, absolutely. Studio photographers will do this, but any type of photographer can do this as well. Now, grey cards are also used to set exposure from as well, and that's a little bit more advanced. It's a topic for the Ultimate Photography program, but they're a very versatile tool for photographers to have. They're called 18% grey cards. 18% grey cards. Now, where have we seen 18% before? Exactly. 18% is what our camera's light meters are calibrated to. Okay, so 18, the reflection of light. Exactly. So they're 18% grey cards. So we can use these for setting exposure as well, but they are also used to set accurate white balance too. Now, focusing, I know, is an area that a lot of photographers struggle with. Okay, so quite often when we're out there photographing and we're trying to focus on our subject, our cameras can really struggle to find focus on a subject. Okay, and it can be absolutely infuriating, when you're under pressure to get the shot. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how we can improve our focusing as well. We said we would talk about focusing here at this stage, and I've left it to this stage really because a big area where photographers will get confused when we have out of focus pictures, majority of the time it's actually going to be our shutter speed is not correct. Okay, so if you're getting very blurry photographs, most of the time it is going to be that you have a shutter speed that is too slow. Okay, but there is times where focusing is going to be an issue as well. Now, for the most part, I assume that you guys have all been using autofocus, and a lot of the time the autofocus does a great job. But just in case you're unsure, when you press your shutter button halfway down, the autofocus mechanism starts to work and the camera will begin to focus for you. Typically, it'll indicate to you in the viewfinder with a solid circle that the image is in focus. And sometimes it'll start to flash if it is unable to focus. So you'll see this, this little dot start to focus, start to blink, and if it's unable to find the focus for you. Now, a lot of the times as well, unless you have it switched off, most cameras will have an audible beep to indicate that the scene is in focus as well. And this beep is extremely useful as it allows you to be reassured that you're in focus without having to keep checking for the circle. And this is especially useful if you have the camera on a tripod or you have it down low where you're not able to look through the viewfinder. The only time the beep might be an issue is when you're in a quiet place and it might cause a disturbance. So if you're, say, at the theatre, during a performance, or you're in a church or something like that, in these situations you can switch off the beep through the camera's menu. Otherwise, it is an excellent feature. Now, when you press that shutter button halfway down, your autofocus goes to work, you hear the beep, and you'll temporarily see some squares light up inside your viewfinder or on your camera's LCD. Now, typically they'll light up in red or green. Okay, red or green depending on your camera. And these areas that light up, these are the areas of the photograph that the camera has chosen to focus from. Now, your camera may not have as many points as this, or might have even more points than this, but the same principles apply. Now, in this particular scene, the autofocus has gotten it right, and you can see that these points sit on top of the subject that we want in focus in this particular scene. Now, autofocus is a very complex thing for the camera to get right, and in any given scene there could be a lot of subjects or objects for the camera to try and focus on. The autofocus system has to try and figure out what object or what subject it's supposed to be in focus, and then quickly make the adjustments to get that object in focus. When autofocus is trying to figure out what to focus on, it doesn't actually know what you want to focus on. The autofocus picks a distance, a depth to focus at, rather than a particular object or subject. Now, in this particular case, because we have this subject close to the camera, in this scene it's decided to focus on the object about half a meter into the scene. And in this particular shot, because we have a shallow depth of field as well, anything on the same plane, anything on the same focus plane as the eagle will be in focus, such as the girl's hand. But because the girl is standing at a distance, she is not in focus. So when you're using autofocus, you always need to have a quick check on your camera's LCDs to make sure that or in the camera's viewfinder as well, to make sure that a focus point is lit up on the subject you want in focus and not on an object behind or in front of what you want. Let's have a look at this in a little bit more detail. So, here we've got this scene. We've seen it plenty of times before. If I want to take this photograph and I'm just using my autofocus, okay, can anybody tell me whereabouts in this particular photograph the autofocus is probably going to focus on? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're absolutely spot on, Debbie, in there straight away. The girl in front. The girl in front. Yes, the person in front. Okay, and the reason it does that is because this person's closest to the camera. It's the easiest thing for the autofocus to focus on, because it typically will focus at whatever is closest to the camera first of all. And yes, sure enough, when we press the shutter button down, we have the camera begins to focus on the scene. It finds a few points and it selects the points on the girl closest to the camera, lights up these points that it's going to use. We take the picture and sure enough, the girl is in focus. Anything that was in the same distance as the girl in front of the lens would be in focus as well. But because everybody's standing behind her, we have a shallow depth of field here as well, everybody else is out of focus. So how can we stop the camera from keeping its focus on the girl? Say if I want to photograph on the gentleman behind her, I want him to be in focus. How can I stop the camera from focusing on the girl? Well, each one of these black squares is a potential focus point that the camera's autofocus system can use. So rather than allowing the camera to select these points for us, luckily the camera allows us to choose the point we can focus from. So focus point selection allows you to select the point that best suits the subject you want in focus. Like a lot of functions on your camera, you will have to have a look at your camera's user manual to see how to use it, okay? Now it's usually very simple to adjust it. It's a very common feature. It's very easy to locate. It's usually used by using a directional dial on your cameras, or sometimes you might need to use the rotating dial on your cameras as well to choose the point that you want. But it'll allow you to select any one of these focus points. Okay, so it'll highlight then in red and green, and we can choose whichever one that we want. So in this case, I'll pick a point on the second subject in the scene, and as usual, I press my shutter halfway down, and the camera will focus on this guy instead. Here I take the shot, and this time I get the results that I want. So being able to choose the focus point that I want, I can select the focus point on the gentleman here instead, rather than the focus points going to the lady here in the front. And again, because I've got a shallow depth of field here as well, everybody in front and behind this gentleman is out of focus, and I get this nice effect. The main thing is that I'm able to override what the autofocus was choosing as the subject to focus on. This is extremely useful when the autofocus keeps getting it wrong. And this is another function that gives you a lot more control over the camera. And I could choose any one of these points. So I can select a point over here on the right, and then I can focus on that lady there in the center of the scene. Okay, and again, my nice shadow depth of field, it isolates her, and everyone in front and behind her is out of focus. Now, the only issue with this, and I'm sure you're thinking this yourselves, is that it's a little bit fiddly. It's a little bit slow. If you're under a lot of pressure and you need to be fast, this can be a bit tough to use, because you have to, trying to select a focus point when there's a lot of movement happening around you and so on. This is quite time consuming. So there is a technique that we can use to speed things up for ourselves. Okay, so if we switch back to the multi-point selection, and we're going to use a technique called center point focusing. Center point focusing. So center point focusing means that we can choose the focus point in the center of the scene. Now, okay, focus point in the very center of the scene. We highlight this one and we select that. Now, this means that the camera will take its focus from the center every time. So when we lightly press the shutter button, it'll always take its focusing from the center of the photograph. Now you're probably thinking, well, that's no good if the subject is not in the center. Well, in these situations, rather than changing the focus point, you'll move the camera until the subject you want is in the center, focus on the subject, and then recompose the scene back to the original composition that you wanted. So let's have a look at that. So Gene, you're asking, what happens if the subject doesn't fall in the square? How do you focus? Well, this is exactly the technique that you're going to use. So you select the center point. Say I want the lady here in the orange to be in focus. I point the camera at her. I lightly press the shutter button to focus on her, and without removing my finger from the shutter button, I recompose the photograph the way that I want. As long as I don't take my finger off the button, the camera will hold focus, and I take the shot, and sure enough, that lady is in focus. Just before we finish up for this evening's lesson as well, I just want to very briefly talk about some of the other focusing modes that you have on your cameras too. Now, I'm just going to use Canon and Nikon as examples here. Every camera is different. They might call these focusing modes something slightly different, but you just have a look at your own camera's manuals to check out and have a look at these. But basically, we've got a few different focusing modes available to us. We have continuous focusing mode, which is called Al Servo or AFC if you're using the Nikon, and this stands for continuous focusing, and is most useful for keeping moving objects sharp. So if you're photographing, say, like this runner here, you would use continuous focusing mode, as it's constantly focusing, it's constantly calibrating and focusing on a subject, and this is great for anything that's moving very, very fast. Okay, so for sports, for wildlife and so on, you might try the continuous focusing mode, and in this mode, the camera is going to do the majority of the work for you when it comes to focusing. We have one shot focusing mode, and this is a single focus capability. Now basically in this mode, when you press the shutter release halfway, the camera begins to focus on the subject just once. There's no continuous adjustment. So one shot focusing mode typically is the mode that we use by default. By default on our cameras, we typically use one shot focusing mode. This is the mode that it's great for using that center point focusing technique. You might have automatic autofocus. Automatic autofocus will basically, the camera will decide the best course of action to take when it comes to focusing. Okay, so you give up control of your focusing here, and basically the camera will decide whether or not to use continuous focusing mode or single focusing mode. I don't think it's a great mode to use, because you lose control over your focusing. It'll make the decisions for you, and so I think it's not a great mode to use in a lot of situations. But it can be useful if you want to just point and shoot and not have to think too much about the technical side of things. And then of course we have our manual focus. A manual focus is exactly what it sounds. We have to focus the scene manually. So the camera is not going to focus for us. It won't focus at all. You lightly press the shutter button and the camera will just take the photograph. Okay, it's not going to try and focus on the scene. You have to manually focus the scene. Now, manual focus is a little bit tricky to master, and you wouldn't use it all the time, but there is some particular situations that you would use it for. Like nighttime photography in particular is one that I can think of where manual focus is very, very useful. Okay, so does everybody understand all of that? Quite a lot to take in now to see in this evening's lesson. We covered a lot tonight, and I know it absolutely flew by, but we did have a look at white balance. We did have a look at color temperature as well. We also had a look at the different types of light that we photograph under, how the auto white balance works, how we can use our white balance presets to override them, manually white balancing a scene using a grey card. You also talked about focus point selection, and we talked about our focusing modes too. Now I can see Kevin saying you're going to watch it again. I do recommend it. It was quite a lot to try and fit in tonight's lesson. So do go over that in your own time as well, should you need to, in the student login area on shawacademy.com. Now, so hard to believe, but we've just completed lesson 7. Lesson 7. We've only got one lesson left to go. One lesson left to go. Lesson 8. We'll talk about that now in a moment as well. So you can contact us at any stage at photography@shawacademy.com. Anything that we didn't get a chance to cover tonight, anything that you're not sure about at all, please just email us there. Our final lesson is going to be the digital image. This is going to be all about how digital images are constructed. So it's going to be all about resolution. We'll talk about file formats, RAW and JPEG files. Very, very important to understand the differences between these files. We'll talk about image size as well. So sizing photographs for online viewing versus printing and so on. We'll also talk about image editing and the role that Photoshop and Lightroom play in our photography too. Now that we are on to the final week as well, folks, just a quick reminder for those of you who are waiting to upgrade to the premium membership that the offer is almost at an end and the clock is ticking. So don't wait too long to upgrade or you could miss out. Now, I know a lot of you are waiting for payday and that as well. So you can email us over if you do want to, you are going to move on to the Ultimate Photography Program. Do email us at photography@shawacademy.com and we can make sure that we reserve a place for you. Now, we've had a lot of questions as well about the final assignments now that we are on the penultimate lesson and we've just got one lesson left. It is time to start thinking about your final assignment as well. So that's going to be available after lesson 8. And this is 25% towards your EQF level 5. Okay, so it's 25% towards your EQF level 5. The other 3 modules, the other 3 semesters on the Ultimate Photography Program, they must be completed to get your 100% to basically give you your professional diploma in photography. But if you just want to complete this course, that'll be available for you after lesson 8, and when you've completed that, you will get a free e-diploma. So you'll find it in your student login area. Okay, you'll have 2 hours to complete it, and you've got 3 grades. So you can get a pass, you can get a merit at 70%, or you can go for your distinction, and I do hope that you're all aiming for that distinction, and that'll be over 85%. Now, if you've been doing those weekly assignments, you really won't have any issues with this at all, as it is based on those questions that you found in those weekly assignments. Now, I've had a lot of emails and a lot of questions from students, since I started speaking about the Ultimate Photography Program and exactly what is included in it. Okay, so I'll break down exactly now what to expect and on the Ultimate Photography Program and who it's for. So it is basically broken down into 3 semesters that continue on from where we leave off on the photography course. You don't need any other knowledge at all. Everything that I teach on this course will prepare you for the Ultimate Photography program, and it's not a sudden jump up in level of photography or skills or anything like that. It's just a continuation on from where we leave off on the photography course. So we begin with our Mastering Light semester, then we move into our Powerful Enhancement semester and a Creative Techniques semester, and each semester is designed to help you master a particular area of photography. So we kick things off with the Mastering Light semester, and this is going to have a look at things like our camera's histogram. Okay, so you'll find your histogram if you ever play back your photographs on your camera and you hit the info button or the display button, you'll see this histogram appear, and we look at that in the first lesson. And basically this will allow us to get incredibly accurate exposures. Okay, the camera's LCD is not reliable for reviewing our photographs in terms of exposure, and this is what we use the histogram for. This will then lead on to having a look at how to master the different metering modes we have on our cameras. And certainly I know after lesson 5, when we had a look at the light meter, there was a lot of questions coming in about things like spot metering, center weighted metering, and so on, and this is exactly what we dig into in that second lesson. Then we go into flash photography, an area that I think a lot of photographers tend to shy away from. They're usually very disappointed with the quality of their flash photographs, but we have a look at how to take control of your flash so that it can become a part of your skills as well as a photographer. And then that leads into studio flash and shaping light, and then we'll move on into our second semester, which is all about powerful enhancements. So we start talking about camera raw and how to edit our photographs in camera raw. We'll have a look at black and white photography then as well, a very in-depth lesson. So we have our scene in black and white, and then we have a look at how to actually create a black and white photographs in the second part of that lesson. Then we talk about high dynamic range photography, and finally then we finish things off even with more advanced areas in photography. So we talk about advanced lens techniques, which goes in depth into how to get better photographs in terms of your landscape and your portrait photography. Then we talk at things about macro, which is actually quite a technical area, which is why it's left to quite late on. And then we also talk about low light, nighttime photography, and finally finish things off with color theory and management. So a huge amount to get stuck into in that course. It's divided into 2 lessons each week. So each week we have our Tuesday lesson, which covers the technical aspect. So for example, with flash photography, we'd look at all the different types of flashes that are available. We'll have a look at how your flashes work and so on. But then the Thursday part of that lesson looks at how to actually apply it to our own photography and to get a little bit more creative with it as well. And with these Thursday sessions, we'll also have a look at different types of equipment, and we'll also be talking about other photographers' work where relevant and so on as well. So the course is designed for everybody that just wants to improve their photography. It's not a course designed just to become a professional, although certainly you would have the skills to become a professional after taking the course. But the only distinction between a professional photographer and enthusiast is a professional can make their living off their photography. Okay, their sole income is taken from their photography. But in terms of the actual quality of the photographs that a professional take, anybody can achieve that, and that's what the Ultimate Photography program is all about. It's just so that we can take the absolute best possible photographs that we know that we are capable of capturing. So it is filling up incredibly fast. There's 75% of places are now gone. Do remember we have other courses that feed into this course as well. So the Photoshop course and the Lightroom course, there's students on those courses that are snapping up places as well. So if you want to avoid disappointment, I'm going to launch the upgrade button there now, and you can click that and it'll bring you through to sign up and get yourself a place on the Ultimate Photography program. Now bear in mind as well, you're going to have access to every other course that we have here in Shaw Academy 2. It's not just the Ultimate Photography program that you're signing up for. Okay, so you can check out, say you might be interested in doing something like our graphic design courses, our Photoshop courses. Maybe you want to get into web development, web design, maybe you want to do marketing, or maybe you just want to look after yourself and get into nutrition, health and fitness and so on. There's a huge amount of courses there available that you'll be able to do as part of the membership. I think one of the best parts of this though is the ability to be able to add 3 family members and friends, and they will have access to all the courses as well. So similar to like Netflix or Spotify, they have their own accounts and they can complete all of these courses, and I think that's absolutely brilliant for anybody who wants to maybe change their career, or for children and so on who are unsure what they want to do when they leave school. To have this ability to try out all of these different courses and get these EQF level 5s as well. So if you have any more questions about that at all, simply type in info and we will get in touch with you. But do be aware that that offer is ending very, very soon. Okay, so I've babbled on long enough about that, so let's see how we are doing for time. So we've got a little bit of time left, so we can try and grab a couple of questions now just before we finish up. Okay. So Dorian, you were asking there how long is UPP. Well, I hope I answered your questions there. So yeah, you're looking at 12 weeks altogether, 2 lessons per week. So you've got 24 lessons altogether. That's a lot to get stuck in there. All right. Rochelle, am I going to need Photoshop for the Ultimate Photography program? No, it's not necessary now. I mean, I do use Photoshop on the course when we look at Adobe Camera Raw, but that doesn't mean that you have to download that program. I always give alternatives anytime I bring up a particular type of editing software or any type of equipment or anything like that. I will always have a list of alternatives as well. So it's not necessary to have Photoshop or Lightroom for the course, but it might be something that you'll consider down the line as well. Jacko, you're asking, do I have any deadlines when I become a premium member? No, that's a good question actually. Yes, so I mean, in terms of the deadline on this photography course, Jacko, that's gone. If you become a premium member, you have access to this course for as long as you are a member then, and it means the same with our assignments and so on as well. For as long as you are a member, you have no deadlines to complete those assignments. Albert, are we going to explore back button focusing? No, we don't explore it at this level, Albert. It is something we do have a look at on the Ultimate Photography program in that advanced lens techniques lesson, Albert. Now, if you are familiar with back button focusing already, it can be used in any of the situations that we were speaking about a little bit earlier on. So if you're using your Al servo modes or those types of modes, Albert, it is still possible to use it. Just to briefly explain what back button focusing is, it basically allows us to select the button on the back of the camera to use that as the one to set the focus. Okay, so this means it frees up your shutter button and it can actually save a huge amount of time, but it takes a little bit of practice, and as I said, it's something we cover at a much later stage. Irene, you're asking, what is the AE -L /AF-L button here? I see this question come up a lot. Irene, that's your auto exposure lock or your auto focus lock. Okay, again, it's actually covered in the metering modes lesson. Okay, so it'll help to lock your settings. So if you've dialed in a particular exposure and you don't want to change it accidentally or anything like that, you can press that button. It'll also lock your focus as well, if you want to make sure that your focus doesn't change in a particular situation too, Irene. Daniel, you say you've just registered for the course, you've just upgraded. That's brilliant, Daniel. Well, really happy to hear that, and I look forward to seeing you on the Ultimate Photography program. I see Carl's just saying that there as well. He's just upgraded too. Great, guys. Happy to hear that, and we'll see you very soon on the Ultimate Photography program. Okay. Emma, you're asking, will the final assignment be new questions? No, No, Emma, they're slightly reworded, okay? So to give you a bit of a tip here, so that final assignment, it is based on your weekly assignments, okay? So if you've been doing those weekly assignments, you shouldn't really have any issue at all in doing that final one. Now, the week 4 assignment will also be posted up as at the same time as the final assignment, so you can complete that week 4 assignment before doing that final assignment as well. Okay, let's see. Will, my namesake there. Okay, so you're asking, should I use Photoshop or should I be using Lightroom? Well, this is the question that we get asked all the time, Will. And I mean, we're going to talk about this a little bit more in the next lesson as well. But basically, I mean, ideally, you should be using both of them. Okay, but if you can only stick with one, I would recommend looking at Lightroom first. Lightroom is designed purely for photographers. Okay, Photoshop is a far broader program. It goes into there's a lot of design elements in terms of Photoshop and so on. You know, it's not just used by photographers. It's used by designers. It's used by architects. It's used by web developers and everything. So it's a very, very broad range that it covers. Lightroom is purely focused on photography, and I think it's a little bit easier to get the grips with as well. So you might check out the Lightroom course as well. Now, okay, so just having a quick look at the time. Okay, so I think we'll leave it there now for this evening's lesson. I hope that everybody enjoyed it, and I will see you all back then very, very soon for our final lesson. Hard to believe we only have one lesson left. Lesson 8, we're going to have a look at the digital image, and we'll talk a little bit more about things like JPEG, RAW files, resolution, and indeed Photoshop and Lightroom as well. So thank you so much for joining me, and I'll talk to you all again very, very soon. Bye bye.